Hello and welcome to Relax History, to the kind of place where time moves slowly and the past feels like a half-remembered dream. Maybe you're under a blanket. Maybe the world around you is finally quiet. Wherever you are, you're safe here tonight. We drift back to a strange belief from the Middle Ages, when some murders weren't seen as crimes, but as messages from God. A man falls. No one investigates. They whisper, "It was God's will." And just like that, the story ends. But why did they believe this? And how did silence become sacred? Let your thoughts slow. Let the candles burn low. And if you're still awake, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Let the night's story begin. It begins with the sound of iron striking stone in a village square in 12th century England. Peasants gather not for a market or sermon, but for judgment. A woman stands at the center, her hands trembling. Nearby, a blackened cauldron hisses. Above the fire, steam curling into the air like a spirit escaping. Inside the pot, water boils. Her crime, accused of theft, involved stealing a single silver ring. There is no witness, no evidence, no clear answer. And so, they turn to the only judge believed to never lie, God. This is the trial by ordeal, ritual of fire and pain, where divine intervention is expected to reveal guilt or innocence. It was not punishment, they said. It was a test. The idea was simple and terrifying. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm. If not, the wound would tell the truth. There were many forms. In the ordeal of hot water, the accused would reach into the boiling pot to retrieve a stone or iron piece from its base. Her arm would then be bound and sealed by a priest. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If the wound had begun to heal cleanly, she was declared innocent. If infected or blistered, she was guilty and punishment would follow. But the truth beneath this belief was harder to grasp. These ordeals weren't scientific nor fair. They often reflected local politics, rumors, and the whims of the powerful. Many times, the accused had no real chance. The church claimed neutrality, but the rituals were wrapped in layers of symbolism and pressure. The public watched with grim patience, waiting not for fairness, but for confirmation. For those in power, it was a convenient system. The trial's outcome could be guided. The priest who bound the wound might tighten it too hard. The heat of the water could be carefully measured, and sometimes the guilty were spared if they had enough favor, or the innocent condemned if they lacked protection. But still, the people believed, because belief was safer than chaos. Because in a world with so few certainties, even fire could feel like order. And so, villagers brought their wives, their sons, their neighbors to the flames and the riverbanks, not with cruelty, but with resignation. They truly thought God would speak, but did he? And if he didn't, who did? The wound is unwrapped on the 3rd day. The village gathers again in quiet anticipation. The air feels colder now, though the fire has long died. The priest, his fingers trembling beneath layers of linen, gently unties the bindings. All eyes fix on the woman's arm. The skin is blistered, angry red. The crowd murmurs. She is guilty, they say. God has judged. But what if her body simply couldn't heal in time? What if her skin was too thin, or the priest bound it too tightly, or the infection had already crept in from the smoke-covered blade? These questions are never asked, not out loud, because in medieval Europe, the body was not just flesh, it was a message. And pain was a kind of language, one that people thought heaven had written. In theory, ordeal trials offered divine justice, but in practice, they were far from fair. Survival wasn't determined by guilt, it was determined by strength, chance, and sometimes political protection. Records from the 12th and 13th centuries tell us something quietly revealing. Many people passed their ordeals. In some places, more than 60% were judged innocent. That seems hopeful until you understand why. Priests, nervous about the weight of judgment, sometimes rigged the ordeal. They cooled the water. They handled the wounds gently. Because what if God didn't intervene? What if the wrong person died? And then, one day, the whole system began to unravel. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pope of the medieval period, grew uneasy. A reforming wave swept across the church, one that questioned whether boiling water and glowing iron could truly reflect divine will. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the church officially banned priests from participating in ordeals. Without a priest's blessing, the rituals lost their sacred power, and slowly the trials faded away. But the belief remained. For centuries, people had been taught to trust that God watched every trial, every burn, every drop of water, that He chose who healed and who did not. The withdrawal of that belief left a vacuum, one that would be filled, in time, by juries, evidence, and secular courts. But something was lost to the strange, haunting comfort of believing that every outcome, no matter how brutal, had divine meaning. And for those who had survived the ordeal, or those who had watched a loved one fail it, that question must have lingered like a scar. Was pain really proof of guilt, or just the sound of silence from a heaven that never spoke? A man runs through the night, his boots slick with mud, his breath ragged with fear. Behind him, voices rise, shouting, swearing, calling for blood. He doesn't stop to explain. He doesn't cry out for mercy. He runs toward the one place no one dares follow with a sword, the church. As the wooden door creaks open and the flicker of candlelight touches his face, he collapses at the altar, clutching the cold stone. He is a murderer, and now he is untouchable. In medieval Europe, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a fortress of divine immunity. From the 8th century onward, the practice of sanctuary allowed accused criminals, even killers, to flee into holy spaces and claim the protection of God. Once within the church walls, a fugitive could not be dragged out, not by kings, not by sheriffs, not even by vengeful relatives. To violate sanctuary was not only a crime against law, but a sin against heaven. The church was seen as sacred ground, consecrated and watched by God. Any blood spilled there could stain an entire community. And so, the unthinkable happened again and again. A man might kill another in a tavern, then race to the chapel and ring the bell, not for prayer, but for protection. The villagers would know. Justice had to wait. The murderer could remain inside for up to 40 days under the church's guard. During that time, he had a single grim choice: stand trial or confess and accept abjuration, banishment. He would be stripped of lands and rights and forced to walk barefoot, carrying a wooden cross, toward the nearest port. There, he would be exiled, sometimes for life. In some cases, the sanctuary seeker never made it that far. They died in the church, sickness, starvation, or grief. In other cases, the townspeople waited like wolves at the door, hoping he'd step outside just once. But still, for those who made it, the sanctuary was a final chance at something like mercy. To modern eyes, it may seem unjust. A murderer protected by stone and prayer, a system that favored the guilty over the grieving. But the medieval world did not always seek punishment. Sometimes it sought balance between sin and redemption, between blood and forgiveness. Sanctuary was not a loophole. It was a form of spiritual justice, rooted in the belief that even the worst soul might still be claimed by God. Still, one wonders, when the candles burned low and the fugitive prayed alone in the cold, silent nave, did he feel saved, or simply forgotten? Inside the dim stone church, time moved differently. For the man who had claimed sanctuary, each day stretched into the next, marked only by the flicker of candlelight, the quiet footsteps of monks, and the meals passed to him by trembling hands. No one spoke unless necessary. There was no comfort in the silence, only a waiting. 40 days to decide, 40 days to reflect, confess, or vanish into legend. Sanctuary was not a hiding place forever. The rules were clear. After 40 days, the accused had to make a choice: face trial, or accept abjuration of the realm of public confession of guilt and permanent exile. It was a path walked by many. Some limped away barefoot, carrying wooden crosses, heads bowed, in shame as they followed predetermined roads to the coast. A sheriff would walk with them, ensuring they did not stray. They were not prisoners, but they were not free either. If they reached the port, they would be placed on a ship, often headed to distant lands. No homeland, no return. Just the sea and the weight of what they had done. But not everyone followed the script. Some men never confessed. They stayed silent. Others confessed falsely, just to escape execution. And a few, more than history cares, to admit simply disappeared before the journey was complete. They melted into forests, into other towns, into the pages of stories never finished. For the crown, this loophole became increasingly frustrating. By the 14th century, rulers began to chip away at sanctuary laws. Cities passed ordinances. The church was pressured to restrict who could claim holy refuge. In time, even sanctuary itself would be abolished. But for hundreds of years, it had served as a strange bridge between justice and mercy, a sacred pause in the machinery of vengeance. It was built not on fairness, but on belief that the soul might be more important than the sword. And what of those 40 days? What did they mean to the one kneeling alone beneath stone arches? For some, it was a time of reflection. For others, it was terror wrapped in holiness. And for a few, it may have been something else entirely, a rehearsal for death, cloaked in prayer and shadow. Even now, we wonder, did sanctuary offer redemption, or simply delay the inevitable toll of guilt? The blade was sharp, but sharper still was the silence that followed. In the year 1179, a man named Arnold of Brescia was strangled and burned by order of the church. His body reduced to ash, his bones scattered in the Tiber River. His crime, preaching against clerical wealth, declaring that the church had lost its soul. For that, he was condemned not as a criminal, but as a heretic. And those who killed him, they were not punished. They were praised. In the medieval world, murder was not always murder. It could be an act of devotion if your target was deemed dangerous to the faith. The church, vast and powerful, faced its enemies with both prayer and steel. Heretics, rebels, apostates, those who questioned doctrine or refused obedience, were seen not as dissenters, but as diseases in the body of Christendom. And just as one might remove a festering wound to save the whole, some believed that killing these people was not a sin, but a sacrifice. In this logic, certain murders became holy. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, searching for signs of theological rot, a wrongly uttered prayer, a refusal to kneel, a woman accused of secret gatherings in the woods. Death followed behind them, draped in robes and crosses. Fires burned in public squares, not to punish, but to purify. Sometimes, these killings were carried out not by clergy or kings, but by ordinary people. A merchant might stab a wandering preacher, believing him to be a threat to orthodoxy. A village might stone a woman suspected of spreading false beliefs. In these moments, the hand that struck was not seen as guilty, it was seen as guided. There were even saints, yes, saints who achieved their holy status through death that came by violence, not only as martyrs, but sometimes as instruments of righteousness. The line blurred between victim and vessel, between blade and blessing. The Church, of course, did not openly sanctify murder, but its silence often spoke volumes, and when those acts served to reinforce the faith, restore obedience, or remove a dangerous voice, many looked the other way. Some even whispered that God had moved through the killer's hand, but deep down, behind the incense and the liturgy, a question remained: when a man kills with scripture on his lips and devotion in his heart, has he done evil, or has he merely obeyed a higher law? In a time when halos were forged from suffering, and sainthood could rise from blood-soaked ground, stories began to circulate softly at first. Then, with growing certainty, a soldier kills a heretic, and has visions in his sleep. A knight slays a pagan chieftain, then renounces all wealth to walk barefoot across Europe. An inquisitor orders the burning of a village, and later dies quietly in his cell, whispering prayers as if nothing had been lost. And slowly, through parchment and pulpit, these figures became revered. In the medieval imagination, holiness was not always gentle. Saints were not merely healers and hermits. They could be warriors, judges, and yes, heaven executioners. Some were made holy because they defended the faith with violence. Take Saint Ferdinand III of Castile, who led military campaigns against the Moors in 13th century Spain. His conquests were not seen as invasions, but as divine cleansing. He became canonized, not in spite of the bloodshed, but because he had united territory under Christian rule. His sword was sanctified by victory. Or consider the quiet transformation of Saint Louis IX of France, who persecuted heretics, burned Jewish texts, and led crusades drenched in blood. And yet, he was canonized just 27 years after his death. His piety was beyond question. The deaths he ordered were framed not as cruelty, but as obedience to God. Even those who never held swords could still be linked to holy violence. Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, never lit a pyre with his own hands, but thousands died under his authority. To some, he was a monster, but to others, he was an agent of purity, ridding the Church of corruption. His legacy sits uncomfortably in the quiet corners of Catholic memory, part relic, part warning. What allowed such transformations? Faith, structure, silence. The Church, facing external threats and internal divisions, needed symbols of stability, figures who stood firm even when their hands were stained. If death could bring unity, then it was justified. If the killer acted on behalf of the divine, then perhaps they were not a sinner, but a vessel. Of course, not all killers became saints. Most were forgotten. But the ones who lived in the folds of Scripture, and still the ones who were remembered, left behind a haunting idea that one could serve God not by healing, but by judging. That heaven might open for the hand that held the blade, and that, sometimes, to the eyes of history, murder looked a lot like martyrdom. It began not with justice, but with vengeance. In the dim morning light of a Saxon village, a father lies dead in the road. By noon, his son has taken up the sword. By evening, a rival family flees into the hills. This was not law. This was balancing, its rawest, most dangerous form. Before kings held courts and sealed scrolls, justice in much of medieval Europe was personal. If someone harmed your kin, It was your right, some said, your duty to respond. Kill for a kill, burn for a burn. The blood feud was not lawless. It was law of a kind, a brutal rhythm of retaliation that governed entire clans for generations. And yet, amidst this chaos, a new idea began to take shape, that vengeance could be replaced, not with forgiveness, but with order. It was called the king's peace. The phrase sounds soft, but it was anything but. It was a bold and radical claim that certain acts of violence were no longer yours to avenge. They belonged to the crown. To harm a man under royal peaces, especially during public gatherings, fairs, or on sacred ground, was not just a crime against him. It was a crime against the king himself. Suddenly, justice had a new shape. It no longer sat in the hands of grieving families, but in courts, where oaths were taken, where verdicts were read aloud, and where punishments came not in rage, but in calculation. To reinforce this new power, monarchs introduced wergelda, system of payments for injury or death. If you killed someone, you might avoid bloodshed by paying silver instead of spilling more blood. A freeman's life might cost 200 shillings, a noble's far more, a serf's perhaps less. It was crude, imperfect, even deeply unfair, but it was the beginning of something. The idea that justice could be managed, that violence could be redirected, that revenge could be paused. Still, the people didn't let go easily. In many regions, blood feuds lingered for centuries. Secret retributions, arranged marriages to settle debts, hidden knives passed between brothers. The king's peace might be written on parchment, but the old ways were carved into memory. And in the spaces between old law and new, between sword and seal, one question echoed through the centuries: was true justice ever found in silver, or just hidden behind a crown? The parchment crackled as the seal was pressed into wax. A name, a date, a verdict, not shouted in vengeance, not carved in blood, but written in slow, careful script by a clerk who had never swung a sword. This was the new face of justice. By the 13th century, royal courts had spread across medieval England and France, echoing through stone halls and market towns. The king's peace was no longer just an idea, it had become a system, complete with traveling judges, formal oaths, and record keepers. Trials were no longer decided by who was strongest, loudest, or angriest. They were decided by procedure. The change felt enormous, and, to many, frustrating. Suddenly, justice required paperwork. Witnesses had to be sworn. Testimonies were copied by scribes who spent more time adjusting their ink than hearing the pain behind the words. There were endless scrolls, court dates, delays. If someone was murdered, the family might wait months, or even years, to see justice served, if it came at all. For some, this new process felt like progressa, move away from personal vengeance, toward something that felt fairer. But for others, it felt like distance, like something had been stolen. In the old way, justice had a face: the brother who avenged his sibling, the father who took back honor. Now, justice came from strangers, men in robes and wigs, quoting laws in Latin, sending scribbled messages to the king. And what of those too poor to pay for lawyers or bribes? What of the peasant whose land was stolen, who couldn't write, who couldn't wait months for a hearing? For them, the new system often felt like a locked door. The king's peace did bring structure, but it also brought favoritism, complexity, and a growing divide between those who understood the law and those who were crushed beneath it. Lords could sway judges, nobles might avoid punishment, and sometimes the guilty walked free, not because they were protected by God, but because they were protected by connections. Still, the people learned to live with it. They memorized the rules. They petitioned the crown. They stood quietly in long lines outside the court, waiting not for vengeance, but for recognition, because, even in its most bureaucratic form, justice offered something powerful, the chance to be heard. And yet, across villages and valleys, some still whispered, was this parchment justice better than the blade? Or had we simply traded violence for silence? The bells toll at dawn not for mass, but for death, in the heart of a medieval town. Streets once filled with merchants and murmurs are now lined with silence. Children peek through shutters. A priest clutches a worn book, and at the center of it all walks a man, barefoot, hands bound, murmuring prayers no one can quite hear. He is not running, he is not fighting, he is walking to the scaffold. And the people say it is right, because in this world, execution was not only punishment, it was ritual. In the Middle Ages, death by the state was a carefully staged event. It began with confession. The condemned was offered absolution, often in the hours just before the sentence. A priest would listen to his sins, bless his soul, and walk beside him in solemn procession. This moment wasn't about justice. It was about cleansing for both the condemned and the crowd. The execution was seen as a final chance for repentance. If the man walked calmly, confessed publicly, and died with dignity, it was believed his soul might still reach heaven. And so, execution became a kind of theater where forgiveness and fear shared the stage. Onlookers gathered not just to witness a sentence, but to be reminded of sin, of order, of the power of the church and the crown. The scaffold stood like an altar. The crowd was the congregation, the condemned. A broken sermon made flesh. Sometimes a last speech was allowed. The condemned might name their crimes, apologize to the crowd, or even cry out thanks for their punishment. These confessions were meant to soothe the living, to reinforce the idea that law had triumphed not just over the body, but over the soul. And the priest remained, even in the final moments, at the gallows, at the stake, at the blocky, whispered prayers over the condemned. Sometimes he kissed their forehead. Sometimes he held their hand, because in the eyes of the church, death even by rope could still lead to salvation. But beneath the prayers and ceremony, one could sense something else, a chill in the air that no sermon could warm. The quiet understanding that not all who died were guilty, and not all who watched were clean. So the people watched, they nodded, they crossed themselves, and then they went home to supper. And as the sun set over the blood-stained wood and the trailing incense, one question lingered, quiet as a prayer. Was this justice, or just tradition dressed in robes? He stood alone, gloved hands resting on the worn handle of his axe. The crowd watched the condemned, but they never watched him. He was necessary, yet invisible, hated, yet needed. His name rarely spoken, just the executioner. And yet, in many towns across medieval Europe, it was the executioner who bore the weight of final justice. To kill under royal or church order was not seen as murder. It was a duty, a burden, one that required precision, ritual, and, sometimes, prayer. The role of the executioner was complex. He was not just a man with a blade, he was part of a sacred machine. The public expected order, dignity, and the appearance of divine will. That meant the executioner had to perform more than a task. He had to stage a ceremony. In some regions, the executioner was required to pray before a beheading, a whispered Latin invocation, a cross traced over the chest. The act of taking a life was never meant to feel casual. It had to feel deliberate, like a sacred weight being passed from sinner to sword. Executioners often lived on the edge of society literally and socially. In many towns, their homes were built outside the walls. They were banned from markets, forbidden to marry in certain churches. Their children often marked by association. Their touch was considered unclean, even cursed. But they served a function. Few dared challenge, and yet some were deeply religious. Some fasted before a hanging. Some asked forgiveness after every act. Some believed their soul might carry fragments of each life they took. Not all were cruel. Some were gentle, even merciful. A skilled executioner could deliver death swiftly, a clean stroke, a tight knot, a quick fall. It was, in their eyes, a final kindness. But if the blow was poor, if the crowd grew restless, if the condemned screamed too long, the blame fell squarely on him. The crowd wanted justice, the church wanted order, the king wanted fear, and the executioner had to carry all three alone. There are records of executioners who retired to monasteries, trying to cleanse their hands of invisible blood. Others vanished entirely, their names erased from memory, replaced only by the role they played. And when they died, some were denied burial in sacred ground, holy enough to carry out God's judgment, but not holy enough to be laid in God's soil. So we ask, when a man is chosen to end lives for the sake of peace, does he become a tool of heaven, or simply a shadow carrying out the orders of men? It began, as many tragedies do, with friendship. Thomas Becket and King Henry II were once inseparable. They hunted together, laughed over wine, whispered secrets in stone chambers. The king saw Becket not just as a servant, but as a brother, an extension of his own will. So when Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, it was not for piety, it was strategy. If the church's most powerful office belonged to his closest ally, then the throne might finally silence the altered. But power changes men. And when Becket put on the robes of a bishop, he also took up its vows. What the king had given him in honor, he now saw as holy responsibility. And soon, the man who once toasted with the king began to defy him in council, in letters, in the eyes of God and men. To Henry, it was betrayal. To Becket, it was divine duty. The church, Becket insisted, must be free from royal interference. Clergy should be judged by canon law, not by the king's courts. The crown saw this as insubordination. Henry saw it as treason. What followed was a storm of exiles, excommunications, and bitter words across the Channel. Becket fled to France. Henry fumed in his castles. Years passed. Reconciliation was attempted, then shattered again. And then, one December night in 1170, in the cold halls of a palace in Normandy, Henry uttered the words that would change history. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" It was not a command. It was a frustration spoken aloud. But words, once released, have weight. For knights, loyal to the king, took his words as holy cause. They crossed the sea, rode to Canterbury, and entered the great cathedral just as Vespers began. There, under the high arches echoing with prayers, they found Becket in his robes. They drew swords. Becket did not flee. He did not beg. He opened his arms to heaven and said, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to die." The first blow struck his head, shattering the bishop's mitre. The second knocked him to his knees. The third split his skull. Blood and brains spilled on the stone floor of the cathedral. The candles kept flickering. The prayers kept echoing. And Thomas Becket lay still beneath the altar. But death was only the beginning. In the days that followed, miracles were reported. His blood, they said, healed the sick. Pilgrims came by the thousands. The church canonized him within 3 years. The king would walk barefoot to his tomb in penance, lashes on his back. And so we ask, when a crown's anger meets a martyr's silence, who truly holds the power? The cathedral floor had barely dried before the stories began. The monks wrapped Becket's broken body in cloth and laid it beneath the great altar. Blood still seeped from his skull. The church was silent but charged, as if heaven itself was, holding its breath. That night, a woman touched a cloth dipped in his blood to her blind child's ease, and the child, they said, could see. Word spread with the wind. The next morning, pilgrims began to arrive. By week's end, they poured into Canterbury by the hundreds. The place where a man had been murdered became a shrine. A new kind of relic had been born, not just bones or fragments of a saint, but the very memory of injustice sealed in blood. Within a year, the Pope had canonized Becket. The speed of it was breathtaking, but it wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Becket's death had exposed the fragile line between crown and church, and the church moved swiftly to enshrine him as a symbol of its authority. If a king could not be punished, his knights would face excommunication, and the saint, once the king's friend, would now stand forever as his judge. Pilgrims brought coins, offerings, prayers. Some came for healing. Others came to be near something they could not explain. The monks at Canterbury kept records of the miracles: a cripple who stood unaided, a woman who dreamed of Becket and awoke cured, a man near death who drank a drop of water mixed with his blood and recovered. It became, in time, the most visited pilgrimage site in England. More than Rome, more than Santiago, people traveled from every corner of Europe, sometimes walking, for months, not because they knew Becket, but because they believed that God had chosen to make his point through a man's violent end. The king himself, racked with guilt or political necessity, perhaps both, walked barefoot to the tomb. He fasted, he wept, he submitted to public scourging by monks, taking lashes across his back, and then he knelt beside the blood-stained spot where Becket had fallen. But did it wash the guilt away? Or did it simply cement the crown's recognition of the church's might? For centuries, the murder of Becket would be retold in whispers, chants, and church windows. It stood as a symbol of defiance, sacrifice, and the strange ways power both crushes and sanctifies. And even today, we still wonder, was it martyrdom, or just politics wrapped in holiness? It may sound absurd to modern ears, but in medieval Europe, animals could be criminals, not just pests to be swatted or driven of factual defendants, summoned to court, tried, and sometimes executed, and among the most frequent offenders, the pig. There are records, real, sober, legal documents, from as early as the 13th century, where pigs stood trial for crimes ranging from theft to murder. One such case, from Falaise in Normandy, tells of a sow that fatally mauled a child. The pig was seized, imprisoned, and brought before a judge. She was assigned a legal representative. Witnesses testified, and after due deliberation, she was sentenced to death by hanging. Why? Why would anyone try an animal in a court designed for humans? The answer lies deep in the medieval mind, where law, morality, and divine order were tightly braided together. Every living thing had a place, a purpose, and a moral role. A pig that killed wasn't just dangerous, it was disobedient to the cosmic hierarchy, and when that hierarchy was disturbed, it had to be publicly restored. The trial wasn't just about the pig, it was about demonstrating that justice was complete, that all creatures, high or low, answered to law. These ceremonies were often elaborate. Judges wore robes, Scribes recorded every word. The accused animal, whether a pig, cow, or even a rooster, might be dressed in clothing, shackled, and brought into the courtroom like any other prisoner. In one bizarre case from 1457, a sow was sentenced to death, but her piglets, accused of being accomplices, were acquitted for lack of evidence. The townspeople came to watch, not because they were cruel, but because these trials gave shape to something deeper, a need for order in a disordered world, in an age where famine, war, and plague could strike without warning. Enforcing justice even upon beasts was a kind of ritual comfort. It reminded people that there were rules, that wrongdoing had consequences, that God's will extended even into the animal kingdom. These animal trials might seem laughable now, but they were taken seriously then, both legally and spiritually. In their eyes, it wasn't madness, it was balance. But even as we read these stories centuries later, we're left with a curious question. If a pig could stand trial for murder, what does that say about the line between instinct and intent? Imagine the silence of the village square. A rope sways from the gallows. A priest murmurs a prayer not for a man, but for a pig. The sow stands beneath the noose, legs bound, eyes wide and unaware. Around her, a small crowd gathers, not jeering, but solemn. The executioner does not hesitate. The pig is lifted, and the sentence is carried out. It feels strange, even theatrical, but to medieval villagers, it was anything but absurd. Animal trials were not isolated oddities. They were rooted in deep beliefs about order, responsibility, and spiritual contamination. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't only a personal tragedy, it was a stain on the land, a disruption of the divine balance. And so, just like with a human criminal, the pig had to be judged and punished to cleanse the community. Even lawyers participated. In some cases, animals were assigned defenders, real advocates, trained in canon or civil law. These lawyers argued passionately that the animal acted under instinct, that it had been provoked, that it had no mens reno guilty mind. Such trials reveal a legal system trying to stretch its reasoning to fit a world that believed animals might carry moral weight. But it wasn't only domestic animals that faced justice. Rats were tried in absentia. Locusts were excommunicated. In 1519, a group of weevils was summoned to court in France. The town argued they had ruined vineyards. The court appointed a defender who argued that the insects were, in fact, part of God's creation, and therefore entitled to the grapes, just as humans were. In some versions, the case ended with the weevils being given land elsewhere. In others, the entire trial collapsed under its own surreal logic. These stories blur the line between courtroom and ritual, between punishment and performance. But under their surface, they show a world hungry for meaning, a world where even a pig's crime had to be interpreted through a moral lens. To try an animal was to acknowledge that nothing was beneath law, not even nature itself. It was, in a way, an effort to tame the chaos of the world with robes, gavels, and public ceremony. And while today we smile at the strangeness of it all, it's worth asking, were they trying to make animals more human, or remind humans they were still part animal? You wake early to the sound of bells. Not church bells, execution bells. They ring low and long, echoing through the narrow stone streets. People rise from bed, they wash, they dress their children, and they walk slowly but eagerly. The square dot, it is not a market day, it is a hanging day. In medieval Europe, executions were more than punishment. They were spectacle, part justice, part warning, part ritual. And in a world without newspapers, police patrols, or surveillance, public death was the state's most visible tool of control. It said, "This is what happens to those who defy order," but it was also something more intimate. These were not anonymous deaths on a distant hill. These were deaths you could watch, smell, and feel. You could see the condemned tremble. You could hear the last words, the gasp, the silence. Execution was a public event, but it was also a performance. Town criers announced it in advance. Merchants set up stalls nearby. Parents brought children to learn the lesson. Clerics preached repentance. And when the platform was raised and the rope tightened, the condemned would often be asked to speak. Some confessed, some prayed, some cursed the crowd, and sometimes the executioner himself was a kind of celebrity. He might arrive in special robes, carrying his tool sword, axe, rope-like, an artist with brushes. His hand had to be steady, his timing precise. A clean beheading could bring cheers. A botched one might invite jeers or even stones. The method varied by crime and country. Hanging was common. Beheading was for nobles. Burning was for heretics. Dismemberment was rare but known. Even boiling in oil happened once. These were not only punishments, they were messages written in flesh. Yet, amid all this brutality, was a strange tenderness. The condemned might be given wine, a priest might whisper absolution, a relative might be allowed to speak. And after the sentence, the crowd often lingered not out of bloodlust, but something closer to ritual grief. They had watched a soul leave the world. Today, we often imagine these crowds as savage, but many were quiet. Many wept, many believed. They had just witnessed divine justice, not because they were cruel, but because they had no other system to believe in. It's easy to judge these rituals from a modern height, but when death was common and safety fragile, these spectacles gave shape to fear and form to justice. Still, one wonders, did they come to see justice served, or simply to feel something that could not be spoken? After the body falls, the crowd does not disperse. Children hold their mothers' hands. Vendors quietly pack up their bread. The executioner coils his rope, still red at the fibers. Somewhere, a dog barks. A few coins are tossed into a wooden bowl, not for the dead, but for the hangman, who, in many towns, is untouchable. He cannot enter churches. He cannot sit in a tavern, and yet his role is sacred. It is strange how death, so visible in the square, could bring such quiet in the soul. Public executions in medieval Europe were designed to teach obedience. The gallows was the blackboard. The condemned was the lesson. Whether thief, heretic, or traitor, each death was an argument that the world had rules and breaking them would bring consequences. But sometimes it didn't work that way. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 was meant to crush Scottish rebellion. Instead, it turned him into a symbol. When Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431, many wept. Even the executioner, legend says, feared damnation for killing her. In those moments, the theater turned against its script. The crowd saw not justice, but injustice, and the state, meant to appear almighty, looked fallible human. Executions were not just about punishment. They were about control over emotion. The state wanted the audience to feel fear, not sympathy, but that was never guaranteed. Sometimes a charismatic criminal would win the crowd. Sometimes a botched death would spark unrest. Sometimes the air would hum with something unspokener, quiet rebellion of the heart. By the 18th century, attitudes began to shift. Some rulers found public executions too chaotic, too unpredictable. They moved them behind prison walls. Death became bureaucratic, clean, efficient, hidden, but something was lost. For the medieval mind, death was not only an end, it was a doorway to judgment, eternity, perhaps even sainthood. To die before others was to become part of the moral memory of the town, and for those left behind, especially the poor, the powerless, the quiet, the sight of death was a reminder, not just of justice, but of the fragility of their own lives. The gallows creaked, the rope swayed, and somewhere, someone whispered a prayer not for the dead, but for themselves. Was the lesson truly about law, or simply about surviving one more day under it? It begins with a deep, echoing toll, one long note, then another. The sound rolls over fields, rooftops, and rivers, calling the town to prayer, or warning it of death. In medieval Europe, bells were more than sound. They were considered alive, baptized, named, and anointed with oil like newborns. Once blessed, they were thought to drive out demons, halt storms, and even cure illness. But they also held a darker mystery. Forging a bell was a sacred and terrifying act. It required not just molten metal, but precise spiritual timing. The bellmaker worked under pressure, prayers recited, holy water sprinkled into the cooling mold, a priest sometimes present to chant over the smoldering bronze. Any misstep, any wrong ingredient or unclean intention was said to curse the bell and all who heard it. In 1288, in a town near Cologne, a newly cast bell cracked during its first toll. Days later, its maker was found dead in the foundry, his body twisted unnaturally. Some whispered that he had used impure metal scrap from old armor, and the spirits of the dead had turned on him. Others claimed he had broken the sacred fast, forging while unclean. This fear was not unique. Bells were believed to contain invisible power. In some villages, a bell was rung to ward off the plague or to chase away devils before childbirth. But their power cut both ways. If a cursed bell rang, it might draw demons instead of drive them out. In Brittany, a legend told of a bell whose toll brought madness, its chime echoing long after the clapper had been removed. Churches guarded their bells like relics. Thieves were sometimes mutilated if caught stealing bell metal, as it was considered a holy substance. To defile a bell by touching it unblessed or casting it for profit was to risk divine punishment. And yet, towns competed to build ever larger bells. A great bell signaled wealth, protection, prestige. Some were so massive they required teams of oxen to raise. But each clang was a reminder. This was not just sound, it was voice, breath, warning. When war came, bells were melted into cannon. The same bronze that once sang hymns now roared with death. And so the boundary between sacred and profane blurred once more. As the bell rings out over the hills, one must wonder, was it calling the faithful to prayer, or warning the earth that something holy had died? The bells had once sung only to the heavens, but in times of war, those same voices were silenced, melted, broken, buried, and what they became was something far darker. By the late Middle Ages, the sacred bronze used to cast bells had become a strategic metal. As kingdoms rose and clashed, their hunger for weapons grew, and churches, once the soul of a village, were stripped for their instruments. Bells were dragged down from towers, carted to forges, and thrown into flames, not for sound, but for slaughter. The metal that once rang out over christenings and weddings now thundered across battlefields. It was not just practical, it was symbolic. To melt a church bell into a cannon was to convert prayer into power. The bell's voice, once meant for God, now belonged to kings, but many believed the bells remembered. In 1421, during the Hussite Wars, a cannon forged from monastery bells exploded during battle, killing dozens of soldiers. Survivors swore they heard a strange echo just before the blast, a tolling that came from nowhere. Whispers spread that the bell had been cursed, its divine purpose defiled. The idea that bells could retaliate their spirits, might linger, was not so far-fetched in a world where objects were still believed to possess soul. And yet, long after the battles were over, the fear remained. Some towns refused to recast old bells, no matter how cracked. They feared disturbing what had once been sacred. Others held rituals to cleanse reclaimed bell metal, asking forgiveness before reuse. In rare cases, melted-down bells were recast into new ones, but only after elaborate ceremonies, including masses for the dead whose names had once been told in bronze back in the bell towers. Those that survived continued their vigil. They rang not just for joy, but for storm warnings, for plague alerts, and to mark the hour of death. One bell might toll for a king and a pauper alike. And always there remained the unspoken memory that the bell's voice, so clear, so commanding, was once born of fire and fear. Even today, when a great bell tolls across a sleeping town, you might feel it deep in your chest, a vibration more than a sound. And if you listen closely, you might wonder, is it the call of faith, or the ghost of a weapon that once dared to speak? It begins with a tap, then a scratch, then silence. For most, the grave marks the end. But in 18th century Europe, a growing fear whispered of something more terrifying than death, being buried before it arrived. The dread of premature burial wasn't born from fantasy, it grew from real, recorded cases. Physicians, limited by the medical understanding of the time, sometimes misdiagnosed deep comas, catalepsy, or collar-induced paralysis as death. In some cases, people were declared dead, only to awaken beneath the soil. This fear wasn't confined to darkened imaginations. It took root in the public mind. Newspapers reported strange stories, grave robbers uncovering coffins scratched from within, corpses turned over, fingers bloodied from desperate escape attempts. Though some tales were likely embellished, enough truth lingered to ignite widespread panic. In Germany, pamphlets warned of the living death, and France debated whether to mandate longer waiting periods before burial. In England, physicians began demanding signs of decomposition before signing death certificates. Some recommended holding a mirror to the mouth or pricking the skin with needles, primitive tests meant to detect life in the still. The fear transformed into invention. Engineers and tinkerers created safety coffins, burial boxes equipped with tubes for air, bells on strings, and flags above ground. One German design featured a glass window above the deceased's face, so a mourner or a watchman could check for movement. In some designs, a handbell was tied to the corpse's wrist, connected to the surface. Should the body stir, the bell would ring, and someone might come. A few of these designs were even patented, and some were built, but no recorded cases prove they ever saved a life. Still, the image remained vivid, a bell ringing softly at midnight in a quiet graveyard. At the heart of this fear was more than just bodily panic. It was about the failure of systems, both medical and spiritual. It questioned the competence of doctors, the timing of fate, and the finality of religious rites. If a person could be buried alive, could they also die unheard, unseen, abandoned by the very people who loved them? The silence of the grave became not a rest, but a question. And so, long before horror films and ghost stories, entire societies sat in quiet fear of a reality worse than death, a reality that asked, what if, after the prayers were spoken and the earth was thrown, you still had one breath left. As fear deepened, communities responded with creativity and obsession. In the 19th century, the idea of being buried alive had evolved from private dread to public protocol. Cities began designing solutions that were both elaborate and grimly poetic. The waiting mortuary was one such answer, quiet chamber near cemeteries where the recently deceased would be laid out and monitored for signs of revival. In Munich, these morgues featured glass walls, attended by staff day and night. A thin silk thread would be tied to the corpse's finger, connected to a bell mounted above the body. The room was still, chilled, lit by flickering oil lamps. If the finger moved even slightly, the bell would ring. Attendants were trained, not only to listen, but to watch the chest rise and fall, the eyes twitch, the lips tremble. For wealthier citizens, private safety vaults were constructed with air shafts, food compartments, and escape ladders. These were not metaphors for peace, they were architectural statements of mistrust. Even in death, some felt safer designing their own return. Poets, too, were captivated. Edgar Allan Poe's tale, The Premature Burial, drew directly from the anxieties of the era, describing the paralyzing terror of consciousness beneath the earth. It wasn't just fiction, it was reflection. Poe's readers knew such stories weren't far from their own nightmares. By mid-century, patents for life-saving coffins surged across Europe and America. Some included levers that would pop open the lid from inside. Others featured horns and speaking tubes leading up through the soil. The grave, once silent, had become a stage for possible voices, but as medical science improved, the frenzy faded. Reliable death tests emerged, and the extreme designs fell out of favor. The safety coffins were eventually seen as curiosities of an era when even death couldn't be trusted. Still, remnants of the fear remain. In a few forgotten graveyards, rusted bells still hang above sunken stones. A frayed string lies motionless beneath the soil never wrung, and yet, standing there, in the fading light, you might wonder, was it just the fear of being buried alive, or the deeper fear that no one would be listening? There was a time when bathing was seen not as cleansing, but corrupting. In the Middle Ages, especially in the earlier centuries, the act of immersing oneself in water was entangled in suspicion. The belief wasn't just about dirt, it was about moral decay. For some monarchs and nobles, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was a dangerous vanity, a gateway for illness, or worse, sin. Enter King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, revered for his piety, generosity, and leadership during the Crusades. He was also known for something less saintly. He reportedly bathed only twice in his life, once at birth and once before his marriage. Though historians debate the literal truth of this, the symbolic point held strong purity was spiritual, not physical. To us, this may sound absurd, but in the medieval mind, bathing was risky. Water opened the skin's pores, they believed, and through those pores, disease could enter. Public bathhouses, popular in early medieval towns, fell into disrepute by the 14th century, associated with immoral behavior, outbreaks of plague, and foreign influence. The church, too, grew uneasy. As monks increasingly promoted spiritual cleanliness, they also condemned the indulgence of the flesh. Bathing became associated with Eastern luxury, especially during and after the Crusades. Even soap imported from Muslim regions was viewed with suspicion. Yet, paradoxically, the court was not without rituals of hygiene. Instead of full immersion, nobles wiped themselves with scented cloths, applied herbal powders, and changed undergarments frequently. Linen, believed to absorb filth, was swapped often among the wealthy. The illusion of cleanliness was favored over its damp, uncertain reality. In some royal households, servants were assigned to comb the king's hair, clean his nails, and even wash his feet in symbolic ceremonies, sets less about hygiene and more about order, status, and control. A clean face was important, a clean conscientizing essential, a clean body, optional. And yet, the scents of court were potent. Frankincense, lavender, sachets, and rosewater disguised what lay beneath. Perfumes masked what soap could not. Curtains and silks were sprayed to keep rooms sweet. Visitors to court might be dazzled by gold, but quietly repelled by the closeness of a monarch who had not seen water in years. Was it dignity, superstition, or simply the nature of power? As candles flickered and dust drifted through the halls of medieval palaces, one couldn't help but ask, what does a ruler's skin hide when it hasn't felt water in decades? The medieval court was a place of ceremony where gestures mattered more than actions, and appearances could outweigh truth. And nowhere was this more evident than in the royal routines of cleanliness. Though monarchs like Louis IX or Henry IV of Castile were known for rarely bathing, their courts still engaged in elaborate hygienic performances. Royal body servants would gently wipe the king's hands and face each morning with cloths soaked in floral waters. Attendants carried silver basins and pitchers filled with warm, scented liquids, not for a bath, but for rinsing the king's fingertips. A gesture repeated before meals and after prayers. These were acts of grace, not sanitation. Across Europe, kings and queens surrounded themselves with layers, both literal and symbolic. Heavy gowns, fur linings, and embroidered tunics were not just for warmth or fashion. They protected the body, concealing it, insulating it. Physical touch became rare, guarded. The body of the monarch was sacred, mysterious, and above the base needs of the common man. But even sacred bodies sweat. Even royalty stank. That's where the rituals of substitution came in. Rooms were sprinkled with rose petals. Lavender was burned in ceramic diffusers. Wardrobes were hung with herbs. Gloves were perfumed inside and out. Some noblemen stuffed rosemary or cloves into their boots to ward off odor, illness, and perhaps scrutiny. The belief that smells could carry disease, what later became known as the miasma theory, shaped these habits. To cleanse the air was to protect the body. To cleanse the body was dangerous, even indulgent. Medieval doctors often warned patients not to bathe during outbreaks of illness. Opening the pores was a risk. In those days, water was not the healer, it was the messenger of plague. And yet, not all avoided bathing entirely. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary was said to enjoy herbal baths, leading to the creation of Hungary water, a blend of rosemary and alcohol that became Europe's first modern perfume. Catherine de' Medici brought perfumed gloves to France from Italy. Royals in southern Europe, closer to the Mediterranean and Islamic traditions of bathing, were more likely to adopt regular washing, though even they did so with caution. Still, among the northern courts, a ruler's piety was better shown through asceticism, not soap, and so the illusion was maintained. The king was never dirty, only divine. His scent, no matter how strong, was not questioned. After all, who could rebuke the body of one chosen by God? Yet behind the perfumed gloves and flowered corridors, a strange thought lingered. What if cleanliness was not just about health, but about control? It was the year 897. The Roman sun hung heavily over the Lateran Basilica. Inside, the air was thick, not only with incense, but with something far more unsettling. A corpse sat upright on a throne, dressed in full papal regalia. The decaying body of Pope Formosus had been exhumed from its grave and placed on trial by his successor, Pope Stephen VI. The eyes were gone. The flesh had turned waxy. But still, a deacon was appointed to speak on Formosus's behalf, answering charges of perjury, apostasy, and illegally assuming the papacy. This event, known as the Cadaver Synod, was not satire. It was deadly serious and tragically real. At the heart of this bizarre spectacle was a deeper rot: the politics of power between the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and the aristocratic families of Rome. Formosus, during his life, had made powerful enemies and questionable alliances. He had supported rival emperors and clashed with influential bishops. His death did not erase these sins, it only postponed the reckoning. In medieval theology, the office of the Pope was sacred. To corrupt it, even in memory, was to taint the whole Church. Pope Stephen VI, desperate to assert his own legitimacy and erase Formosus's influence, staged a grotesque performance of divine justice. The body was tried, found guilty, and all of Formosus's papal axes ordinations, his decisions, his legitimacy, were declared void. His corpse was stripped of its robes. The fingers he had used to bless were cut off, and he was thrown into the Tiber River. But justice, in this case, was not eternal. The people of Rome, horrified by the spectacle, soon rose up. Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned and later strangled in his cell. Formosus's body was recovered and reburied in peace. Later popes would annul the Cadaver Synod entirely, declaring it a travesty, and yet the image remains: a court convened to prosecute a dead man, priests judging a hollow shell, holy men driven mad by politics. It forces us to ask not about the sanity of those involved, but about the nature of revenge cloaked in ritual. How could a faith that preached forgiveness stage such an unforgiving scene? And if the dead could be dragged back for judgment, who among the living could truly rest? At first glance, the Cadaver Synod seems like madness, a grotesque mistake of an unstable papacy. But within the eerie silence of that courtroom and the dead weight of Formosus on his throne lay something calculated, even strategic. This was more than revenge. It was symbolic. Erasure. In the late 9th century, the papacy was a fragile office caught in the turbulent wake of the collapsing Carolingian Empire. Popes were not just religious leaders, they were political brokers, kingmakers, and power players in an unstable world. The throne of St. Peter was coveted, and for every pope ordained, there were rival factions whispering in the shadows. Formosus had played this game well, too well, in fact. He had crowned emperors, excommunicated opponents, and made enemies in both Rome and the empire. Even after his death, his decisions had weight. If his papacy could be declared invalid, so too could the bishops he appointed, and with that, the balance of power could shift. So Pope Stephen VI's trial was not just grotesque, was a purge, a spectacle meant to undo political damage and reassert control. Medieval justice, especially within the Church, was deeply ritualistic. By dressing Formosus in sacred vestments and placing him before a tribunal, Stephen turned a decaying body into an object of public penance. The degradation of Formosus's corpse was not just physical, it was theological. By symbolically cutting off the fingers of blessing, the Church tried to erase the authority he once held, and the people, they watched, not because they believed in the justice of it, but because in Rome, spectacle mattered. Power was maintained not through quiet consensus, but through dramatic assertion. A pope putting his predecessor on trial, even dead, sent a terrifying message: your past will not protect you. But the gamble backfired. When the crowd saw the dead pope dishonored, something broke. The grotesque theater exposed the fragility of spiritual authority when wielded without humility. Rome turned on Stephen. The papacy, already unstable, slipped into deeper chaos. And years later, as calmer voices took power, the church tried to pretend it never happened. The trial was annulled, the records buried, the doctrine restabilized, but the story lived on quietly, awkwardly, like a forgotten scar on the body of Christendom. And so you wonder if even popes could be dragged back from their graves and humiliated by the living. Was the church punishing heretics, or simply haunted by its own reflection? It begins with a sound, a deep, measured, toll-slow, and solemn cutting through the dusk like a shepherd's call over a restless flock. One bell, then another, echoing from hilltop chapels and town steeples. In medieval Europe, this sound marked the curfew, from the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. You, living in a village beneath stone towers and thatched roofs, knew what it meant. It was time to retreat, to douse the hearth, close the shutters, quiet the animals, and settle into sleep, not by choice, but by edict. The bell was law. In a world before clocks, before streetlights or police, the curfew bell was timekeeper, rulemaker, and guardian of order. It rang not only in towns, but in hearts. Its toll marked the final boundary between sanctioned activity and forbidden wandering. The curfew wasn't just about sleep, it was about control. Authorities feared the night. Fire could leap from one timbered house to the next. Crime could fester unseen. Heresy and rebellion, too, were said to walk best in the dark. And so the bell gave structure. With the toll, local lords and city magistrates hoped to freeze society into place, locking every man, woman, and child into predictable stillness. Monasteries led the way, their hours strictly divided by bells that ordered monks to pray, work, or rest. Townsfolk soon adopted the practice. Bells rang at sunset, sometimes again at midnight and at dawn. They turned each day into a measured circular rhythm imposed by iron and rope. So your life followed the bell. You'd hear it while tending your fields in twilight, knowing you had just minutes left to gather tools and walk home before it was too late. At home, you'd bank the fire, burying the flames beneath ash to keep coals alive for morning, but hidden enough to prevent danger. Candles were snuffed, voices grew hushed, and though no guard came to knock at your door, you knew. Those who wandered past the bell's hour were watched, distrusted. They were outsiders, or worse, a spect, but who decided when enough time had passed? Why did some towns enforce silence so tightly, while others allowed light and laughter long into the night? Was the bell for your safety or your obedience? And as you lay beneath wool blankets, listening to the distant toll fade into silence, you might ask, was it sleep you were being given, or permission to disappear for a while? The streets after curfew were not truly empty. They belonged to a different kind of citizen. You'd hear the shuffle of boots, a creak of leather, the occasional murmur of a guard whispering into the darkness. In many towns across medieval Europe, from Norwich to Nuremberg, the curfew bell did not only signal bedtime, it summoned the watchers, those tasked with patrolling the silence, night watchmen. Often volunteers or poorly paid conscripts bore torches, clubs, and keys. Their job was not glorious. It was cold, long, and lonely. Yet these men were entrusted with enormous authority. If you were caught out after the bell's toll without reason or rite, might be fined, arrested, or worse, especially if you were a stranger. Their lanterns flickered against alley walls, lighting sudden corners where mischief could hide. They sniffed for smoke scene of an unbanked fire, a violation that could mean devastation for an entire town. Fire was no small fear. Entire cities had burned because someone had dared to ignore the bell. But sometimes, these men were not protectors. Some were drunk, others took bribes. A few grew addicted to their unchecked power-demanding silence, not just from streets, but from people, yet life didn't always stop cleanly with the bell. What if a woman went into labor? What if a shepherd's flock escaped? What if a son didn't return from the fields before dark? The rules were clear, but life was not. Some risked moving under cloak, whispering along walls, praying not to meet the watch. Even in silence, the city breathed. The baker might rise before dawn to warm his oven in secret. A priest might sneak to offer last rites. Lovers tiptoed down alleys, hearts pounding louder than their steps. The curfew made everything after dusk feel forbidden, even if it was only tender, and slowly, as centuries passed, the bells lost their hold. With fire regulations, professional police, and safer cities, the need for an enforced bedtime faded. By the 17th century, the bell still tolled in some places, but more out of tradition than necessity. Still, when you stand in a quiet old village today and hear a bell echo at twilight, you might wonder, was this the hour when fear took hold, or when peace began? Did the bells serve the people, or train them to serve the silence? It is strange to imagine, isn't it? A quiet courtroom, a solemn judge, and in the defendant's place, not a man but a pig, muzzled, still waiting for the verdict. In the strange annals of medieval European law, animals were not outside the reach of justice. In fact, for centuries, they were tried, convicted, and even executed under the full weight of the legal system. The idea may seem absurd to us now, but in the 13th to 17th centuries, this was accepted, even expected. A pig that killed a child might be arrested and jailed. A rooster accused of laying an EGA, supposed demonic act, could be burned at the stake. Locusts could be summoned to court for destroying crops. Rats, mice, dogs, and even insects stood as defendants before the law. And the trials were not mockery. They followed due process. There were lawyers appointed to defend the animal. Charges were read aloud, witnesses testified, and punishments were severe. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a sow was sentenced to death for killing a young boy. She was dressed in human clothing and publicly hanged-watched by townsfolk, as though witnessing justice unfold. The act was brutal, but it was also symbolic. To the medieval mind, justice was not only about reason, it was about order. Even cosmic balance. Animals were part of the moral universe. If they harmed a human, they were not simply wild, they were seen as disobedient, even evil. Some scholars of the time believed Satan could possess beasts, just as he did people, and so, holding them accountable was not only legal, it was theological. Sometimes, the opposite occurred. In rare cases, animals were pardoned. A cow might be spared if she was provoked. A swarm of beetles could be forgiven if they were believed to be acting on divine impulse. The law recognized that not all creatures sinned with intent. Behind these strange spectacles lay deeper questions. What does justice mean when applied to those without reason? Was this about punishment or control? Did the people truly believe animals could choose right from wrong? Or was this a ritual meant to remind humans of their own fragile place in the world? The answers lie somewhere between fear and philosophy, And as you picture that silent courtroom again, you might ask, did the pig feel shame under the judge's gazer? Were the eyes that watched her the ones truly on trial? In the year 1510, in the small French town of Autun, a peculiar court case unfolded not against a person, but against rats. The townspeople had grown desperate. Their grain stores had been gnawed to ruin, their fields ravaged. So, rather than relying solely on traps or cats, they turned to the church and the courtroom. A formal summons was issued, penned by the town's legal clerk, and posted publicly on the church doors. It called upon all rats dwelling in Autun and surrounding parishes to appear before the ecclesiastical court to answer for their crimes against humanity. The rats, of course, did not show up, so the town appointed a legal advocate to defend them, a learned man named Barthélemy de Chassenous. His argument, the rats, he claimed, had not received the summons fairly. The notices were only posted in Autun, not in all the rural villages where the rats lived. Moreover, he argued, the rats could not safely travel to court due to the presence of cats on the roads, posing a serious threat to their lives. The court, astonishingly, took the defense seriously. They delayed the hearing. Further notices were issued, and still, of course, no rats arrived. It may seem comical now, but in its own way, it was entirely sincere. Medieval society did not separate the legal, the spiritual, and the symbolic, the way we do today. A court case against rats wasn't only about punishing pests, it was a public act of appeal to the divine. It was a cry for order, for moral restoration, for deliverance from chaos. By naming the wrongdoers and calling them to account, even symbolically, the people believed they were inviting cosmic justice. And it wasn't just about pests. Insects, too, could be excommunicated. In 1659, locusts in Lausanne, Switzerland, were placed under ecclesiastical banishment. Prayers were offered. Rituals were held. Sometimes, these spiritual judgments were followed by a surprising result. The pests left, perhaps coincidental, perhaps not. But to those communities, it was enough. It's easy to laugh. But under the surface, these trials reveal a deep human impulse to make sense of suffering, to restore order in times of disorder, and to believe that even the smallest creatures are part of a world ruled by justice, however strange that justice may appear. What would it mean, we might ask, if every creature, great or small, were bound by law? And if not, then where exactly do we draw the line between the moral and the meaningless? Perhaps, as the final parchment was rolled and sealed with wax, it was never really about the rats at all, but about us. It was called the King's Evil, a terrible name for a terrible disease, scrofula form of tuberculosis that swelled the lymph nodes in the neck until they ruptured, leaving angry wounds that would not heal. It was painful, it was disfiguring, and for hundreds of years, it was believed there was only one real cure, the touch of a king. In medieval England and France, the monarch's body was thought to carry divine properties, a holy inheritance passed down not by biology, but by sacred appointment. The king ruled not just by sword or crown, but by God. His blood, his breath, even his fingertips were sacred instruments of healing, so they came, hundreds at a time. The sick, the broken, the desperate, they gathered in cathedrals and courtyards, the blind, the bleeding, the mothers carrying children with twisted limbs, all waiting for the moment when the king, resplendent in gold or red, would lower his hand and brush their skin with holy fingers. La roite, touche, dierte, garizi. The king touches you, may God heal you. The ceremony was precise. Some kings followed it more devoutly than others. Edward the Confessor, whose very body was later believed incorrupt after death, was said to have performed the healing ritual with deep humility. Henry VII of England had special coins minted and pressed into the hands of those he touched. Touch pieces, they were called, carried like relics long after the king had passed on. But this was more than ritual. For many, it was the final hope. The ritual drew power, not just from the king, but from the presence of the crowd. The incense, the hymns, healing, they believed, was not just about medicine, it was about harmony, about restoring a cosmic balance. It's easy to see it as superstition. But pause for a moment. In a world before antibiotics, before germ theory, before anesthetics, what else was left but faith? What balm was there for a child with open sores, a man whose face bore the stink of rotting glands? And strangely, some did improve. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe the immune system, maybe the body responding to the warmth, the peace, the hope, or maybe it was the ritual itself that healed not in cells, but in spirit. Still, one must wonder, did the kings believe it too? As they placed their fingers on trembling skin, did they feel power pass through them more? Did they carry the burden of a lie? And what happened on those quiet nights after the crowds dispersed, when even a king had no miracle left to give? In the flickering twilight of a great hall, after the incense had cleared and the crowd had thinned, the king would sometimes sit in silence, his fingers stained with oil, perhaps with the faint scent of illness still clinging to his robe. The ritual of the royal touch was more than a performance. For some monarchs, it was a profound spiritual obligation. For others, it was a weary expectation, another symbol to maintain, like the crown or the scepter. But always, it was political. To deny the touch was to deny God's will. Scrofula didn't care for crowns, of course. It struck paupers and nobles alike. It came in winter, when the air was wet and still, when the poor huddled together for warmth and food grew thin. Some monarchs touched a few dozen patients each year. Others, like Louis XIV of France, reportedly touched thousands each year of his reign. And yet, healing remained elusive. The disease was stubborn. The symptoms lingered. For every person who claimed miraculous recovery, many more lived on with open wounds and unanswered prayers. Still, they returned. Not because they truly believed the king's touch could stop the infection, but because they needed to believe. Something could. Faith, after all, is not the same as certainty. It is what fills the cracks when nothing else remains. Over time, the ritual began to fade. Science crept into the courts. Enlightenment thinkers questioned the divine right of kings. The public, slowly, began to understand that disease was not a punishment from God, nor a curse of the soul. When Queen Anne ruled England in the early 18th century, she still performed the touch, one of the last British monarchs to do so. But her successor, King George I, a German who spoke little English and cared even less for medieval traditions, refused. He dismissed it as superstition. The ceremony stopped, but the people still remembered. Even after the rituals ended, the touch pieces were kept in drawers, tucked into children's pockets, slipped beneath pillows. Long after the kings stopped touching, the belief lingered, quiet, private, deeply human. Perhaps that is what makes the story so haunting. Not that a king could heal, but that he wanted to, or needed to. That in a world filled with plagues, famine, and suffering, even a monarch at the very pinnacle of power could only lay his hands on the broken and whisper hope, and walk away. What then does that say about the power we still assign to symbols, to hands, to crowns? And in our modern age, who do we ask to touch us now?